In the early days of World War II, long before the Marines stormed the beaches of Tarawa or climbed the ridges of Okinawa, one quiet fact sat beneath every battle report and every diary entry. The average American Marine was about 3.5 inches taller and nearly 80 pounds heavier than the average Japanese soldier. And while that sounds like a random trivial line, out in the Pacific, where rain fell sideways, where the jungles swallowed men whole, and where every ridge was a knife fight in mud, it shaped everything from the way men fought to the way they survived. American Marines were corn-fed kids from Ohio farms, steel mill sons from Pennsylvania, city boys from Detroit who'd grown up hauling crates. And when they landed in the Pacific, they carried not just rifles, grenades, and rations, but sheer physical mass. Bigger frames, stronger shoulders, longer reach. Meanwhile, the Japanese army fielded soldiers who were often lean, underfed, raised in a nation with smaller average diets, and trained in a doctrine that worshipped endurance over size, meaning they could march 30 miles on a bowl of rice, dig foxholes with bare hands, and crawl through gaps an American couldn't even fit a helmet through. But size isn't everything. The Japanese compensated with fanatic discipline, night infiltration tactics, and an almost terrifying willingness to die for the emperor. And the Marines, tough as they were, quickly learned that being bigger didn't mean winning easily. It just meant the fights were brutal in a different way. And as these two forces collided across island after island, from the steaming coral atolls to the volcanic nightmares like Iwo Jima, the differences in height and weight started shaping battlefield outcomes. Heavier Marines could carry more ammo, resist disease longer, haul wounded buddies under fire, and absorb shrapnel hits that might have dropped a smaller man instantly. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers, lighter, faster, and able to disappear into foliage like ghosts, turned every ridge into a maze and every bunker into a trap. So, when the first reports came back in 1942 saying U.S. troops were physically towering over their opponents, the American public thought it meant easy victories. But Marines on the ground knew the truth. Size helped, but the Pacific didn't care if you were 5'3" or 6'2". It only cared if you could survive one more night, one more ambush, one more charge through a jungle that felt like it wanted to kill you as badly as the enemy did. As the war dragged deeper into 1943, the physical mismatch between the Marines and Japanese soldiers became even more obvious during close-quarters combat. The kind where nobody cared about strategy maps or fancy speeches in Washington. Just raw strength, speed, and fear. Marines in places like Guadalcanal remembered how patrols would stumble into sudden bayonet charges, Japanese troops sprinting from the tree line with wild cries, and while American size often gave them the leverage to wrestle a rifle away or land a heavier punch, the Japanese fought with a kind of wiry, coiled energy that turned every hand-to-hand clash into something almost primal, like two animals battling for inches of dirt. And the terrain only magnified the difference. Marines carrying heavier gear because their bodies could physically handle it marched through waist-deep mud and monsoon rain with packs that weighed as much as some Japanese soldiers, while the Japanese, smaller and lighter, slipped through jungle paths like shadows, often barefoot or in thin split-toe boots. Moving so quietly, a patrol could walk right past them without realizing death was sitting 3 feet away behind a log. But the real effect of the height and weight difference showed up during bunker assaults. Big Marines with flamethrowers or demolition charges had the muscle to push forward under fire, eating rounds in their packs, absorbing shock waves, hauling their wounded back with brute force. While the Japanese defenders, inside cramped underground positions, were often so small they could crouch in tunnels too narrow for an American to even enter. It created this strange reality where the Marines dominated open ground with their size and firepower. But once the fight moved underground, the Japanese used their smaller stature like a weapon, popping out of hidden exits, crawling through air shafts, even launching sneak attacks through tunnels the thickness of a drainage pipe. And yet, despite all those physical contrasts, Marines wrote home that their enemy was tough as rawhide, unbelievably stubborn, and hard to kill even when hit. Because being smaller didn't mean being weaker. It meant being hardened by years of harsh training, limited food, and a culture that taught soldiers the highest honor wasn't living, but dying in service. Still, in the long run, the American size advantage added up. Heavier bodies meant more calories burned, but also more strength for lifting artillery shells, manning heavy machine guns, or carrying water cans up cliffs. And commanders noticed that Marine units held lines longer before collapsing from fatigue. This wasn't some cartoonish mismatch. It was 2 completely different human builds forged by 2 completely different nations, smashing into each other on tiny islands where everything smelled like rot, cordite, and rain. And every inch of height or pound of muscle could be the difference between getting out alive or being just another name carved on a memorial. By late 1943, during the brutal campaigns in places like Cape Gloucester and Bougainville, Marine officers began openly acknowledging that the physical differences between the 2 armies were influencing the rhythm of every battle, not just the outcome. American Marines averaging around 5'8" to 5'10" and often weighing 160 to 180 pounds moved through the jungle like a bulldozer. Strong, stocky, able to shoulder heavy BARs, flamethrower tanks, and ammo belts that Japanese soldiers, usually 5'3" to 5'5" and barely 120 pounds, simply couldn't manage. But that didn't mean the Marines always had the upper hand, because the Japanese compensated with an insane level of conditioning that bordered on superhuman. Marines wrote in their diaries how Japanese patrols could walk for hours without water, scale muddy hillsides like mountain goats, and attack at night with a kind of fearless precision that made the darkness feel alive. And when it came to fortifications, the Japanese turned their size into a tactical advantage. They carved spiderweb bunkers with crawl spaces no Marine could squeeze into, tunnels barely wider than a man's shoulders, firing slits designed for small frames, and interconnected cave systems where a lightweight soldier could slip through, reappear behind American lines, and turn a routine clearing operation into a nightmare. The Marines, for all their size and strength, found themselves fighting an enemy who could vanish into holes like some kind of underground phantom. Still, the Americans' larger frames brought one crucial advantage: stamina under load. They could carry water, grenades, radios, mortars, and still fight. While the Japanese fought with astonishing bravery, their smaller bodies and limited wartime rations meant they simply couldn't absorb wounds the same way. Marines described hitting a Japanese soldier center mass and seeing him drop instantly, while American Marines, after months of protein-rich rations and conditioning, could sometimes take a grazing bullet or shrapnel hit and keep charging. But that didn't make things easier mentally. The Marines were constantly shocked by how the Japanese refused to surrender even when wounded or cornered. So these physical contrasts created a bizarre pattern. Americans dominated firefights with raw power, but the Japanese often controlled the terrain with their bodies, turning every ridge, cave, and foxhole into a defender's paradise. And as the battles intensified, the U.S. military started realizing that while having bigger, stronger Marines helped win fights, the real challenge was overcoming an enemy that fought with the level of adaptability and sheer willpower that didn't care about height charts or weight numbers. What mattered in the end was grit. And on both sides there was plenty of it, poured out in sweat, exhaustion, and blood across islands the average American back home couldn't even find on a map. When the island-hopping campaign rolled into 1944, places like Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu turned into massive proving grounds where the physical gap between Marines and Japanese soldiers became impossible to ignore, even for commanders who usually brushed off those details as trivia. Marines landing on Saipan remembered how, during the first chaotic hours on the beach, the Japanese defenders, lean, fast, and dug into spider-hole systems, seemed to pop up from the sand itself, firing rifles at point-blank range before disappearing into narrow tunnels too tight for an American's shoulders. Marines were bigger, yes, but that size came with a price. They couldn't melt into terrain the same way, couldn't hide in shallow depressions, couldn't squeeze into tiny cover spaces, and when they advanced through the cane fields or the jagged volcanic ridges, their silhouettes stood out higher, easier targets for Japanese snipers who'd trained since childhood to steady a rifle with monk-like discipline. But the moment the Marines closed the distance, the situation flipped. In those brutal, sweaty, nose-to-nose fights, the extra weight and muscle of the Americans often turned the tide. Rifles swung like clubs, trench knives flashed in the dark, bodies slammed into bodies, and Marines used raw strength to overpower Japanese soldiers who fought like fanatics but simply couldn't match the sheer mass hitting them. On Peleliu's lunar-like coral ridges, Marines carrying 70 to 90-pound loads climbed under scorching heat, their bigger frames letting them haul extra canteens and ammo that Japanese troops, weakened by months of starvation rations, struggled to match. But even then, the Japanese still made the Marines work for every inch. They were small enough to snake through the labyrinth of caves, fire a burst, vanish, reappear behind American lines, and leave Marines wondering if the island itself was alive. After battles, corpsmen and medics noticed something else. The American Marines, with their heavier builds, survived wounds that would have been fatal to many Japanese defenders. More muscle meant thicker tissue, more fat to slow shrapnel, and stronger bodies to endure shock. Yet despite that advantage, no Marine ever walked away from these battles claiming they'd had it easy. The Japanese fought with such unbreakable resolve that size felt like just one more tool, not a guaranteed win. And in letters home, Marines wrote things like, "We're bigger, yeah, But that doesn't matter much when a guy half your size charges you at midnight with a bayonet and doesn't care if he dies doing it. The Pacific wasn't a place where numbers told the whole story. It was a place where every ounce of strength, every footstep in the mud, every night listening for whispers in the jungle, added up into a grinding struggle that tested men of all sizes, all nations, and all backgrounds. As 1944 turned into the bloody crucible of 1945, the height and weight difference between American Marines and Japanese soldiers reached its most dramatic expression on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Two islands where every inch of ground cost more than most humans can mentally imagine, and where the physical build of each side shaped the brutality in ways that reports back home never explained. On Iwo Jima, Marines, mostly tall, muscular farm kids and factory boys, hit the beaches carrying 90-pound loads, flamethrowers slung over shoulders, and rifles that felt twice as heavy once the volcanic ash soaked everything. That thick black ash was a cruel equalizer, making strong men sink knee-deep as if they were walking on burning coffee grounds. Meanwhile, the Japanese defenders, smaller and lighter, used that same terrain to their advantage, crawling through it with surprising ease as they moved between underground bunkers, slipping into cave mouths no American could fit through, and firing from firing ports that were only shoulder-high for a Marine, but perfectly aligned for a Japanese soldier barely over 5 feet tall. But once the fight got close, inside pillboxes, in trench cuts, around blasted rocks, the Marines' extra 70 to 80 pounds of muscle became a weapon all its own. Bodies slammed into each other, men wrestled for rifles, and Marines often physically overwhelmed defenders who, despite fighting like cornered wolves, simply lacked the size for a prolonged grapple. Yet even with that strength advantage, Iwo Jima felt like a nightmare that didn't care how tall or heavy anyone was. The Japanese were so entrenched, so committed, so convinced death was preferable to surrender, that Marines described the enemy as iron men in small bodies. And by the time the campaign shifted to Okinawa, the largest ground battle of the Pacific, the difference in size showed up in endurance. Marines were strong enough to haul wounded men through mud and monsoon rain, to carry heavy BARs up ridgelines named Death Valley, and to keep fighting even with exhaustion tugging at them like a weight around their necks. But the Japanese fought with a terrifying stamina of their own. Tunnels stretching miles underground allowed smaller soldiers to move quickly, strike unexpectedly, and retreat long before an American could squeeze through the same openings. Corpsmen noted again and again how American Marines survived gut wounds, leg wounds, even bone fractures, thanks to thicker frames and better nutrition, while Japanese soldiers, gaunt and dehydrated, running on minimal rations, often died from wounds that would have been survivable with more body mass. Still, none of that made the battles easier, because the Japanese compensated with sheer ferocity.
Night charges, suicide assaults, hidden grenades, bayonet attacks that felt almost mythical in their intensity. And so the physical contrast that looked simple on paper, 3.5 inches taller, 80 pounds heavier, turned into this complicated, raw, brutal reality where strength clashed with endurance, mass met fanaticism, and two armies built completely differently bled across islands that neither side had ever heard of before the war. Islands that would forever be etched into American memory as places where young men discovered what the limits of the human body and the human spirit really looked like.
As the Okinawa campaign dragged deeper into the summer of 1945, the contrast between the Marines' larger, heavier frames and the Japanese soldiers' smaller, wirier builds shaped not just the battles, but the way each side actually lived on the island. Marines, with their broader shoulders and longer limbs, struggled to move quietly in the thick sugarcane and dense jungle patches, their helmets brushing against leaves and giving away positions, while the Japanese, compact, light, and trained from boot camp to move with silent discipline, could slip through the same vegetation like ghosts, sometimes passing within arm's reach of American patrols without making a single sound. Marines often joked that they felt like lumbering bears hunting foxes, but there was nothing funny about the ambushes that followed. Japanese infiltrators used their smaller frames to slide into drainage ditches, hide under collapsed huts, even wedge themselves into blown-out tree hollows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, the Marines' size advantage became critical in the grueling defensive fights that took place along Okinawa's horrifying ridgelines, where rains turned dirt into knee-deep sludge, and wounded men had to be dragged up slopes slick as soap. Marines, bigger and stronger, often carried 2 wounded buddies at once, something Japanese medics simply couldn't physically manage with their underfed soldiers. And food, that was another place the physical gap showed its teeth. American Marines consumed heavy rations packed with calories, meat, sugar, fats, maintaining their mass even under hellish conditions, while Japanese soldiers, already small to begin with, were starving by the day, surviving on handfuls of rice or whatever roots they could scavenge at night. That difference became obvious in body-to-body combat. Marines hit like sledgehammers, their punches and rifle butts carrying the weight of men who grew up strong, while Japanese defenders, courageous but running on empty, fought with technique and ferocity, but not the raw mass to match the blow-for-blow exchange. Yet Japanese morale didn't break. If anything, their smaller bodies seemed to house bigger determination. Marines wrote in letters home that they were stunned by how Japanese soldiers kept fighting even when down to skin and bone, even when malaria shook their hands, even when they had no realistic chance of victory. And in a strange, dark way, the Marines respected that, pointing out that while Americans had a physical edge, the Japanese had a psychological one. Total commitment, total willingness to die, and total belief that surrender meant shame worse than death. The physical difference mattered, yes, but the one thing Marines kept learning over and over on those rain-soaked hills, those muddy paddies, those screaming ridgelines, was that size alone could never define the outcome. What decided battles was heart, grit, and the willingness to keep moving forward when your body wanted to shut down. On Okinawa, both sides had that in terrifying amounts, which is why the island became the bloodiest ground battle of the Pacific, a place where big Marines and small Japanese soldiers alike were pushed past the limits of the human body into a realm of endurance that no statistic on height or weight could ever fully explain.
As the Okinawa campaign dragged deeper into the summer of 1945, the contrast between the Marines' larger, heavier frames and the Japanese soldiers' smaller, wirier builds shaped not just the battles, but the way each side actually lived on the island. Marines, with their broader shoulders and longer limbs, struggled to move quietly in the thick sugar cane and dense jungle patches, their helmets brushing against leaves and giving away positions, while the Japanese, compact, light, and trained from boot camp to move with silent discipline, could slip through the same vegetation like ghosts, sometimes passing within arm's reach of American patrols without making a single sound. Marines often joked that they felt like lumbering bears hunting foxes, but there was nothing funny about the ambushes that followed. Japanese infiltrators used their smaller frames to slide into drainage ditches, hide under collapsed huts, even wedge themselves into blown-out tree hollows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, the Marine size advantage became critical in the grueling defensive fights that took place along Okinawa's horrifying ridge lines, where rains turned dirt into knee-deep sludge, and wounded men had to be dragged up slopes slick as soap. Marines, bigger and stronger, often carried two wounded buddies at once, something Japanese medics simply couldn't physically manage with their underfed soldiers. And food, that was another place the physical gap showed its teeth. American Marines consumed heavy rations packed with calories, meat, sugar, fats, maintaining their mass even under hellish conditions, while Japanese soldiers, already small to begin with, were starving by the day, surviving on handfuls of rice or whatever roots they could scavenge at night. That difference became obvious in body-to-body combat. Marines hit like sledgehammers, their punches and rifle butts carrying the weight of men who grew up strong, while Japanese defenders, courageous but running on empty, fought with technique and ferocity, but not the raw mass to match the blow-for-blow exchange. Yet Japanese morale didn't break. If anything, their smaller bodies seemed to house bigger determination. Marines wrote in letters home that they were stunned by how Japanese soldiers kept fighting even when down to skin and bone, even when malaria shook their hands, even when they had no realistic chance of victory. And in a strange, dark way, the Marines respected that, pointing out that while Americans had a physical edge, the Japanese had a psychological one. Total commitment, total willingness to die, and total belief that surrender meant shame worse than death. The physical difference mattered, yes, but the one thing Marines kept learning, over and over on those rain-soaked hills, those muddy paddies, those screaming ridgelines, was that size alone could never define the outcome. What decided battles was heart, grit, and the willingness to keep moving forward when your body wanted to shut down. On Okinawa, both sides had that in terrifying amounts, which is why the island became the bloodiest ground battle of the Pacific, a place where big Marines and small Japanese soldiers alike were pushed past the limits of the human body into a realm of endurance that no statistic on height or weight could ever fully explain. By the time the Pacific War finally slammed to a halt in August 1945, after islands soaked in blood and skies filled with smoke, the world began to look back at this strange statistic. American Marines averaging 3.5 inches taller and nearly 80 pounds heavier than Japanese soldiers, and people realized it was more than just numbers on paper. It was a symbol of two nations built on totally different foundations, one powered by massive industrial might, abundant food, and young men raised on protein-rich diets, the other forged through scarcity, discipline, and a culture that praised silent endurance over brute strength. But the Marines who fought in those jungles and coral ridges didn't walk away bragging about height or weight. They walked away carrying memories of men who fought them with impossible courage. Men who, despite being smaller and often starving, didn't stop resisting until the very last second. And the Japanese survivors, looking back, admitted they had never faced an enemy so physically overwhelming, an army of giants who brought not just size, but firepower and raw determination into every battle. In the end, the Pacific War wasn't decided by inches or pounds. It was decided by logistics, spirit, strategy, and the unbreakable will of young men on both sides who were thrown into places like Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and Tarawa and told to fight for ground that often didn't feel worth dying for. The Marine size helped them carry more, endure more, and survive more wounds, yes. But what truly won the war wasn't weight. It was resilience, teamwork, and the belief that they had to finish the job so they could finally go home. And when those Marines sailed back across the Pacific, stepping onto American soil with the war behind them, they carried a quiet respect for the small, wiry soldiers they had faced. Because size may define the body, but in war, it's the spirit inside that tells the real story. And that, folks, is the incredible story behind why American Marines in World War II were built bigger, fought harder, and yet still found themselves challenged by some of the toughest, most determined soldiers the world has ever seen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, if you liked the storytelling, and if you learned something new today, make sure to hit that like button, tap subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you never miss another story from the past brought to life. Your support keeps this channel growing, keeps these stories coming, and it means the world to me. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep exploring history.